This brings us to chapter 12 and what are known as the more detailed stipulations. But before we look at those, I'd like to just take a bit of time to consider how do we interpret and how do we apply Old Testament law. Some of the things that are general about faithfulness to God or about not murdering or stealing, these are straightforward enough. But how do we relate to these smaller laws that we're seeing? How do we know which of those apply to us and which don't? And what do we do with them? So I'd like to take some time to look at that, because what I want you to do is to be able to have the right spectacles, the right glasses. As you work through the School of Biblical Studies, what we desire for you is that you'll be able to engage well with every different kind of genre we find in Scripture, whether it is historical or prophets or poetry, or of course the New Testament Gospels, letters. But here we have Old Testament law material that we're looking at. And so the question is, how do we engage with it in a way that is consistent and a way that is edifying and connected to us today? So it's not just an exercise that doesn't affect us. So the first thing I would say is just to remind us that the law is ancient Israel's national constitution. It was how their nation should be governed, and it had been modelled after the ancient Near Eastern vassal treaties or suzerainty covenants. And so that is the foundation that we have been talking about. But accepting that, how does it work today? Many years ago, when I was living in Brighton, England, and attending a church, there was a really good Baptist church that I was part of. I remember one Sunday morning, as one of the leaders of the youth group, I remember how this lady, an older lady in the congregation, she called me aside, and I sat down in the pew there. And what she did was she turned to Deuteronomy 22 and to verse 5. And she read this verse to me. A woman shall not wear a man's apparel, nor shall a man put on a woman's garment. For whoever does such a thing is abhorrent to the Lord, or is an abomination to the Lord your God. Now that is a very strong word, isn't it? That if a woman or a man mix their clothing, then they're abomination to the Lord. And then she went on to say, I've noticed that many of the girls in the youth group are wearing jeans, or they're wearing trousers. They're not wearing dresses or skirts. And she said, I'm really concerned for them because these people are putting themselves under the judgment of God because of this thing that they're doing. And so we talked about that for a while, and I'm not actually sure what I said to her. I don't remember what I said to her. But it certainly came out of a sincere heart as far as she was concerned. I don't think she was trying to be judgmental or critical. It was the fact that what she saw here was that those who wear clothes from the other sex are under the judgment of God, and she was concerned for these people, these young women in their youth group. As I've got to know the Bible more and had time to reflect on this, I find it now interesting, looking at this, that she wasn't concerned about verse 11. Now, verse 11 is also about clothing. You shall not wear clothes made of wool or linen woven together. And so here is a clothing instruction, and that didn't seem to be a problem for her. And there's another passage here, and that is, yes, verse 12, the next verse. You shall make tassels on the four corners of the cloak with which you cover yourself. Now, I didn't look, but I'm almost absolutely certain, really, that she didn't have any tassels on the clothes that she was wearing. And I didn't have, and she didn't seem to be concerned about that. In fact, nobody did, and that wasn't a concern for her. Now, I want you to know this dynamic. Verse 5 was a problem. She felt verse 5 applied today to those young women, but for some reason verse 11 didn't apply, and nor did verse 12. And this, I think, is a great illustration of the kind of situation we find ourselves in, where it's possible through culture or through misunderstanding that we can somehow take some verses from the law material, and they seem to apply, and then there's others that somehow don't apply. And this is something that is not lost on people. I've got here just a screenshot of Google, where we have people who believe in the legitimacy of same-sex marriage or same-sex activity as being legitimate. And what they're doing is they're criticizing Christians who would go to the Old Testament, and they would take passages from Leviticus 18 or 20 that speak out against that kind of sexual activity. And they would say, you're all a bunch of hypocrites, you Christians, because you pick out that verse and say that verse applies today. But what about the other verses that talk about the cleansing of a woman after childbirth, or a woman in her menstrual period should be separated from people and be unclean for 7 days? And what about the food laws, where you shouldn't eat various kinds of food? And there will be this criticism of people that because they seem to take some verses and make them relevant to today and not others. And I think it's fair to say that there is often this bit of confusion. What applies today and what doesn't? Now, some of the answers to this is, well, there's 3 different groups of laws. There's the moral law, that applies today. And then there's the civil law, and that is useful, and maybe we can learn some things from it. And then there's ceremonial law, and that is fulfilled in Christ. Well, this is a very popular definition or breakdown of law. The problem is, how can we be sure that some of the ceremonial law isn't actually moral law, or some of the civil law isn't moral law? Who decides what is moral law or not? But more than that, that isn't how the Old Testament is presented. The Old Testament, the law, isn't presented in these different groups. That is something, a breakdown that we impose upon it. And therefore we can end up in confusion. Now, what I'd like to do is to present to you a model that I think is really useful for us being able to be clear about what is relevant for today for us as New Testament believers, and what was for them back then and is not relevant today. Now, if it's not relevant today, there's a sense that it is relevant because it is still God's Word. The Apostle Paul says all Scriptures is inspired by God, and it's profitable for preaching, for training and teaching and correction. And these things are still of value. And so the question is, if it isn't a part of a stipulation of the covenant today, how does it become the Word of God to us? Even as we recognize it was certainly the Word of God to them. And so that is what I'd like to do. Now, I'd like to do this by having you just imagine with me that we have a contract of employment. This, of course, is oversimplified, but just for the sake of illustration, just imagine that you had a job and you had a contract with your employer, and the contract stated that you should start work at 8 o'clock, and you had a break for coffee, maybe about 10:30. You took your lunch hour from 1 to 2, and you finished at 5:30. So this was your day in this job. You worked 5 days a week, and you had to work Saturday morning for a few hours. The nature of the work was data entry. That's what you did. You sat there putting data into the computer, and you were granted 3 weeks holiday, and you had 5 days holiday over the Christmas New Year period. So that is your contract. And now imagine with me that you have this job, you're faithful in that job, but then the evenings, weekends when you're not working, you take the initiative to do some evening classes, extra courses, and you qualify as a computer programmer. So you now have this extra skill, extra qualification, and it so happens your company actually need a computer programmer. And so when you see this need, you apply for the job, and you go through the interview process, and then to your joy, you're successful. You're now employed as a computer programmer. But what happens, of course, it's a new job. It's another job. And so you have to then enter into a new contract of employment. And the new contract of employment says that you start at 8:30. You have a coffee break between 10 and 10:30. Lunch between 1 and 2. You finish at 5:30. But this job is only 5 days a week. And you get 4 weeks holiday every year. And you get more time off at Christmas. And so I want you to see this illustration here. When you compare these two contracts together, what you notice is that there are some of the stipulations that are the same and some of them that are different. Before, when you were involved in data entry, you started at 8 o'clock. Now, in this new agreement, you start at 8:30. And even as you have that extra 30 minutes in bed or at home, you don't feel guilty. You don't think that you're playing hooky from work, because you no longer have to be in at 8 o'clock. That has changed. You now have to start at 8:30. When it comes to the coffee break, it's the same as it was before. Those stipulations haven't changed, nor has the lunch time or the finish time. But when it comes to the vacation, you have 4 weeks. And before you only had 3, but now you had 4. And when you're enjoying your 4th week of vacation, you don't think to yourself, now should I only have 3 or should I not have 3? You don't think that, because you've entered into a new covenant or a new agreement. And so I think you can see the parallel here. And that is, when we come to the Old Testament, when we come to this portion of Scripture, we are looking at a covenant that God made with ancient Israel. That covenant was made at Mount Sinai. It was made with this group that God had freed out of Egypt. That covenant was not made with you and me. it was made with ancient Israel. And so this old covenant, it is not our covenant. It is a covenant with ancient Israel. Now, when we come to what we call the New Testament or the New Covenant, you'll know that Jesus, when he was in the upper room, when he was seated with these disciples, he inaugurated, he made a new covenant. And that is the covenant that we are part of. It was a covenant born out of his death and his resurrection. Now, what is interesting is if we go back to Jeremiah 33 verse 33, this is Jeremiah speaking just before Jerusalem falls to the Babylonians, after hundreds of years of God sending prophets and people to bring Israel back to covenant faithfulness. When we come to that moment, Jeremiah says in Jeremiah 33:33 that the days are coming when God is going to make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And so we need to understand that actually the new covenant is firstly made with the people of Israel. Jeremiah goes on to say that it is not like the old covenant which they broke, even though I was like a husband to them, but it's going to be a new covenant. And then he talks about how this new covenant is going to be based on forgiveness. It's going to be based on all of people knowing him. It's going to be based on the foundation of him remembering sins and misdeeds no more. It's a marvelous covenant. But what I want you to understand is that this new covenant was made with the house of Judah and the house of Israel. So this covenant we have in Sinai, it's not that it's not in force for us, but it's not even in force for Israel, because God has now introduced a new covenant. And when Jesus was sitting in the upper room, there were 12 disciples around him. That so clearly represents Israel, the 12 tribes of Israel. And there he entered into a new covenant. And then that covenant was inaugurated, of course, through his death, his resurrection. The covenant included a meal. The covenant included blood that was shed, just like we'd spoken about in a previous session. But then we come to the day of Pentecost. And we have the wonderful outpouring of the Holy Spirit. And we have a Jewish people coming into the church. And so we see in Acts, in those early chapters of Acts, that the church, the new covenant, was made up of people who were Jewish people. And it took a while before Gentiles entered in. It wasn't until chapter 10, you remember in Acts, the Cornelius stories, where it took a lot for Peter to accept that Gentiles could be included in this group. And then if you've studied the New Testament, you'll know the big discussions in those early years, those years of the early church among the Jewish people. If Gentiles are going to be included, should they become proselytes first? Should they become Jews first? Because the new covenant is a Jewish thing. And there was lots of debates about that. And you'll remember in Acts chapter 15, that was a council that settled the issue. And the result of that was Gentiles do not need to become Jews first, but rather the new covenant is God's provision for all peoples, Jews and Gentiles alike. And so it's really helpful for us to be clear about this, that the covenant we are in is not the old covenant. It is, so that old covenant is no longer valid, but rather we are people of the new covenant. Now, Even we find strong words in the book of Hebrews. You remember the book of Hebrews was this document written to Jewish believers. And so we see this new covenant which we read about in Jeremiah 31 verse 31. I said 33 verse 33 before, that was incorrect. Jeremiah 31 verse 31. This covenant was first inaugurated for the Jewish people, the house of Judah, the house of Israel, and we Gentiles have become part of that new covenant. Now, it's really helpful that we make a distinction, because you see, the old covenant that we're dealing with is no longer in force, but it is still God's word. And so what we see is, as we compare the old and the new covenants, there's a number of stipulations of the old covenant that are restated in the new. And if those stipulations are restated, then they apply to us today just as they did back then. If those stipulations are not restated, then they do not apply to us in that way. There's certainly application we can gain from it. There's things we can learn. It is God's word to us, but not in the sense of being like a covenant stipulation. And I want to suggest to you that this is a really helpful way for us to ascertain whether a law in the Old Testament is still relevant, because it's not arbitrary. It's not based on trying to figure out, is this moral or civil or ceremonial, but rather it's very clear. If it's restated in the new, it still has significance for us today. If it's not restated in the new, well, what do we do with it? And that's what I would like to talk about now. So in our last session, we were discussing how do we relate as New Covenant believers to Old Testament law. This question, how do we know which of these laws apply to us today and those that don't? How can we decide that without being arbitrary? And I suggested that actually the answer is not too complicated. Rather, we should recognize that we are people of a new covenant. The Old Testament was a covenant that was written not for us, but written and indeed for ancient Israel. And so it's not God's word to us, but it is God's word for us, because all Scripture is inspired of God. And as we said, profitable for teaching, reproof, correction, and training in righteousness. And so I suggested that we recognize we're people of the new covenant, and what we do is we ask the question, is this stipulation in the old restated in the new? And so as if we accept that as a good working model to understand this system, a way to make decisions that are not arbitrary, not personal, not like this dear lady I spoke about in the last session, who was concerned about Deuteronomy 22 verse 5. Her concern was probably out of her own church culture or denominational understanding. So rather than making decisions on those kind of basis, we're able to let the Scripture itself speak to us as to how we handle this. And so, accepting that that's a good working model, then the question is, what do we do with those laws, those stipulations that are not restated in the new covenant? How does that become the Word of God for us? And what I'd like to do is to think about that for a moment with you. And so, the first thing I'd like to say is we do need to remember that all of the Old Testament does point to Jesus. And this is something that we're probably familiar with, that so many of those laws are in fact pointers, are types, and they point to the life and the work of Jesus. Now, the New Testament, the book of Hebrews, makes this point, when so much of the ceremonial law especially the various sacrifices, the Day of Atonement, and all of these things are pointing forward to the redeeming work of the Lord Jesus Christ. There's a fascinating scripture in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 23, 22 following, and it speaks there about if someone is hanging on a tree, then they're accursed. And they shouldn't stay there overnight. And you read this law and you're not quite sure why it's there or what the purpose of it is. But then you come to Galatians chapter 3 and the Apostle Paul takes this up and talks about how Jesus, he hung on the tree. He hung on the cross. And because of this law, he was indeed accursed for us. And he took the curse of the law for us. And so as we have New Testament eyes and read the Old Testament, then very often we're able to see reflections of the very person and the work of Jesus in these Old Testament laws. But there's also another way we can reflect on these laws. And that is there wisdom for us? Is there wisdom of God for us? Because the one who gave this constitution to Israel wasn't just a group of human people in the room figuring this out, but this is the all-wise, all-knowing, all-loving God that was giving this constitution to his people. And so we recognize that even though it was a very different culture and a very different time, and the topography of the land may have been very different to maybe what we experience now, nonetheless, is there any wisdom? When it comes to this question, are the stipulations restated in the New? When we reflect on the Ten Commandments, you will know that the first one, you shall have no other gods before me, that is restated in the New. You shall not make any graven image. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. This is restated in the New. But when it comes to remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, you'll remember, especially if you've studied Romans, how at the end of Romans the Apostle Paul was very clear when he was talking about observing days. For some people, he said, there's days which are special, and they observe those days, as unto the Lord. And there's other people, they take all days the same, but they do it as unto the Lord. And whether you observe days or don't observe special days, what we need to do is not judge and despise one another for these different perspectives. And so what you see there is that there's a recognition that there's differences on this, and that the Sabbath observance isn't something that is mandatory in the New Testament. And then you look at the rest of the Ten Commandments, and all the rest of those are in fact restated in the New. And so when it comes to those foundation commandments, most of them are restated, but not this one about the Sabbath. And so we could say then, it doesn't matter, we don't have to observe it. But what you find when you come to the New is that Hebrews takes the concept of Sabbath and gives it a whole greater, fuller meaning. When he talks there in chapter 3 and 4 about the Sabbath rest that we can have. When we come into that place of faith, in trusting God for our salvation, as well as the hope of the Sabbath rest for the future. But also as we look at the purpose of the Sabbath in the Old Testament, in God's law, that Sabbath was a gift to Israel because it enabled them to rest. Not just the people, but even, as I said, the working animals. And so we can see the wisdom in the rhythm of work and rest. Rest and work both are a gift of God, and both are a reflection of God, because we read in Genesis, of course, that 6 days God labored and he rested on the seventh, and we are made in his image. So we are made to work hard, but also to rest well. And if people don't take rest and refreshment, then often there's a consequence to that in their health and in other ways as well. And so we could ask the question, is there any wisdom here for me to learn? And so there's different perspectives that we can take when we consider the Old Testament laws. But I want to give you another model that I have found really helpful, and I trust and hope you will find helpful too. A very concrete way we can think through these many laws that aren't restated in the New, and indeed those that are. But the first thing I want to say is it's good for us to remember when we explore these individual laws that just because they are in the covenant, in the Old Testament Constitution, it doesn't necessarily mean that these laws are there because they are the highest good that God would want for a society. Now, the reason I say this is because of some words of Jesus in Mark chapter 10. You may remember that there was a discussion that Jesus was having with the Pharisees. In fact, the Pharisees were trying to catch him out. And they said to him, Jesus, can a man divorce his wife for any reason? And Jesus responded by saying, you know what the law says. And what he was referring to is what we find in Deuteronomy 24. The first 4 verses talk about divorce. And there's a particular law there about if a woman divorces her husband and marries someone else and then divorces him and comes back, and it's all a little bit of an interesting law. But they were reading that particular law, and from that they assumed that divorce was acceptable. And they said, yes, what you have to do, according to the law, is simply write out a bill of divorce. There isn't any reasons for the divorce mentioned in that law. And so that's what they said to Jesus. And Jesus' response is really interesting, because he says, yes, that is what Moses wrote, but you need to know it was because of the hardness of your hearts that Moses gave that law. From the beginning, that was not the way God intended it to be. And in those verses, Jesus took them back to Genesis chapter 2, and talks about he created male and female, and they came together and became one flesh. And what God, of course, joins together should stay together. And so in this really profound passage, we see Jesus express in the heart of God that in the law and different laws in the Old Testament are not the highest that God had for his people, but because of the hardness of heart, because of the fallenness of humanity, God brought in some of these laws, not because this was the highest, but because this was the lowest, and there was no going below that. In other words, many of these laws are a protection for the vulnerable. Certainly, it would seem that law on divorce, there is a protection from this woman who could get passed around from man to man. It was a protection. And there's other laws too, that when you read them and you think, how strange is this? But what it is God bringing in a law that was relevant to that society and the way the culture was, and God was wanting to be a protection for people. So I think it's really helpful to remember that. We know that the heart of God, and in the new heaven and in the new earth, there will be no destructive patriarchal culture. There will be no war. There would be no slavery. There will be none of these things that have been so much part of society ever since the fall of humanity. And these things are still a reality today. And so often what we see is God works within that, recognizing because of the fallenness, these things probably won't change. But there's safeguards that are brought in and protections that are brought in because there's a recognition that because of the fallenness of people, these different things would probably be a reality. And certainly we see this throughout the life of Israel. And so just to mention that as you study these laws, just recognize that what you're reading is not necessarily the highest that God has. Now, why is it that King David would have the kind of Psalms and speak about the law the way he does, saying the law of the Lord is perfect and it's changing my heart and it's like honey and all these beautiful metaphors of the law? Well, the reason I believe is that he, as a head of state, he had to govern his people. And as that person who had that responsibility, and he looked at the law in relationship to running his nation, he saw the very profound wisdom of God, because within the law there is such a lot of mercy. And I trust that you will see that as you continue to study. So, what do we do with those laws that are not restated in the New? Well, as inductive Bible study students, you know that before application, there needs to be careful observation and good interpretation. And so one of the things we're trying to do is ask the question, how would this law have been worked out 3,500 years ago in the nation of Israel, in the ancient Near East there, with the particular cultures and situation they find themselves in? What would it look like very practically? And as we look at these laws and we ask that question, then the good observation, the good interpretation becomes a good foundation for us to build an application. I want to draw your attention to something else that Jesus said that I think is really important for us. And that is another discussion with the scribes and the Pharisees, the Sadducees, in Matthew 22. Because there, the question was, which is the greatest of the commandments? And you'll remember how Jesus answered them, that question. The first was from Deuteronomy 6, about loving the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, mind and strength. And the other from Leviticus 20, how you should love your neighbor as you love yourself. And having given these two laws that kind of summarize all the other laws, Jesus then said something very profound. He said, on these two commandments rest all of the law and the prophets. In other words, every law that is there, and I understand that rabbis have counted 623 laws. All of these laws, individual laws, all of these laws rest on these two. They could all be summed up with either loving God or loving your neighbor. And what this scripture tells us is that the underlying principle, the thing that was foundational in the constitution that God gave Israel, was that of relationships. Relationships were the most important thing. And in many societies, when decisions are made, the decisions are not based on relationships, they're based on economics. It's economics that decide what is done. But in God's economy, it wasn't economics, it was relationships. And you'll see as the different laws are worked through, this becomes that underlying thread between all of the laws. Now, on the screen there you see what I call my Old Testament law application triangle. You'll notice there that at the top of the triangle, at the point they're closest together, we have Matthew 22, these two commandments of loving God and loving your neighbour. But as you go down that triangle and it gets bigger, you have the Ten Commandments. Because the Ten Commandments are, of course, not two commands, but 10. But actually, what they are doing is taking those two commandments and bringing a greater concreteness to them. Like this is what it actually means. If I'm going to love God, how am I going to love God? Well, I'm going to have no other gods before Him. I'm not going to make any graven image. I'm not going to take His name in vain. I'm going to remember the Sabbath day. But then the ones about loving your neighbour. How are you going to love your neighbour? Well, I'm going to enable them to have the day of rest once in 7 for those that are in my responsibility. I'm going to honour my father and mother. I'm not going to murder someone or commit adultery, etc. And so you can see how the Ten Commandments are concrete outworkings of the two commandments. But then at the bottom of the covenant triangle, you have the 613 laws, all those individual laws. And each of those individual laws are actually an outworking of the 10. And the 10 are the outworking of the 2. And so the point of every law that we have is either it's an outworking of loving God or loving your neighbour, or of course sometime both. Now, just to make this very practical, we'll look at some of these laws in Deuteronomy 25. This is where we begin to get a lot of independent general laws, as Deuteronomy, the specific principles as they're coming to a conclusion. And we could look at Deuteronomy 22 verse 1, and we see these, one rather random law. You shall not watch your neighbour's ox or sheep straying away and ignore them. You shall take them back to their owner. Now, when I read that, that would seem a little bit strange, because in the culture I live in, here in England, we don't have animals wandering around, and it's if ever a cow or a sheep was to escape from the farmer's field, it would be a crisis. They would be on the road, the police would probably come, and it would be a minor but recognisable incident. And so I think it's fair to say that this doesn't apply directly to me in my situation. Of course, there are parts of the world where this does apply, and it is just as it says. But in my situation, it really doesn't apply. And so what do I do with this law? Do I ignore it? Does it have nothing to say to me? Well, let's just think about interpretation. When it comes to the ox, an ox was part of the wealth of a family, and it was also their farming machinery. We would think of it today. It'd be used for ploughing up the land, and it would have other uses too. The sheep would be a means of wool and possibly food as well. Milk would come from a sheep. And so you can see that these animals, they were very valuable, and they were people's property. And when these animals wander away, what kind of society did God want Israel to be? Well, He wanted it to be the kind of society where people were looking out for one another. And if your property wanders, I'm going to take initiative to look after that and help protect that for you. I'm not going to take it into my compound and secretly slaughter the sheep and have an extra food that night, or add it to my own flock. I'm not going to steal it, but I'm going to make sure that you get your property back. Now, in my culture, it might not be a sheep. It might not be an ox, but it may be someone's handbag. It may be someone's purse. It may be someone's wallet or their phone or some other item that someone would lose. And so when that happens, what am I going to do? Am I going to keep it, sell it, or am I going to give it? And so you can see that in a small way here, this law may not apply to me directly, but there's a principle behind it, and that principle is, how do I love my neighbour? And as I reflect on that, I can see the heart of God in this random law. And it's something that it does make sense. Verse 2, if the owner does not reside near you and you do not know who the owner is, you shall bring it to your own house and it shall remain with you. And with you until the owner claims it. Then you will return it to your neighbour. So here's a different scenario where you actually don't know who this animal belongs to. Often in these smaller communities in ancient times, everybody would know every animal and who they belong to. But a scenario here is that you don't know. But what you do out of love for your neighbour is you look after their property. You look after these animals and think of the inconvenience and the cost that you would have to pay to feed these animals and clean up after them and just keep them. And you know, because they are part of the wealth of someone's, some other family, they will be looking for that animal. And when they look for it, you don't hide it, you give it back. And so again, it's talking about the kind of society. And what would this mean? Well, if I found something that belonged to someone and I didn't know who it was, then in my particular situation here in England, the thing we would do with it is maybe take it to the police station. Or maybe put it out on some local kind of media that this thing has been found. And all of that, of course, takes time and it takes effort. Getting into our town can be a time-consuming thing with the parking issues. But nonetheless, what I do is I do what I can to get this back to the right owner. And you see, this is talking about the kind of society. Is it a kind of society where you have to watch your things, you have to wear your backpack on the front of you, not on the back, because if you wear it on the back, somebody's going to come along and steal something from it? Is that the kind of society we want? Or do we want a kind of society where there's looking out for one another? And of course, the answer to that is obvious. And we see this is what God wanted for Israel. And then, just in case people were trying to be pedantic, verse 3, you shall do the same with your neighbour's donkey. You shall do the same with your neighbour's garment. You shall do the same with anything else that your neighbour loses and you find it. You shall not withhold your help. And so these first three verses, in many of our cultures, societies, they don't have any direct connection. But as we think of the triangle and we think of the relationship of this law to the Ten Commandments and then how to love God or your neighbour, we see that there's a great application for us. Not just for us personally, but for the society that we live in. You shall not see your neighbour's donkey or ox fallen on the road and ignore it. You should help lift it up. Now, in some societies, even today, donkeys being beasts of burden, they can be loaded very high with all sorts of produce or items. And you may have seen this. You may live in a country where this is a common practice still. But in the country I live in, this isn't a practice. In fact, if this was to happen, probably the owners would be in trouble for cruelty to animals. But this was the practice. People would load these beasts up. And if the beast was to stumble, then the beast would fall over and not be able to get up again. And so what would need to happen is the goods would need to be unloaded from the animal put up again, made sure that they weren't injured, and then the load put back on. And that would have been time consuming. And what it says here, that if you see this thing happen, you help. Now, as I said, in my society that's not the case, but there's many situations where I would maybe see someone in trouble. It may be that someone's pushing a car at the side of the road to try and get it started. It may be a young mother coming out of a supermarket with 2 or 3 kids and loads of bags of shopping. It could be an older person that needs to have something done. And the principle is the same. It may not be animals, but the principle is helping someone in a situation in need. And so you can see this is an application of loving your neighbour as you would love yourself. And so the specifics may not apply, but the heart behind it is still very relevant. And then we have this particular law we spoke about at the beginning of this discussion. A woman shall not wear a man's apparel, and a man shall not put on a woman's garment, for whoever does such a thing is abhorrent to the Lord your God. And so, as we think of this, let's think interpretation. What would this have meant 3,500 years ago? And I would suggest that it doesn't actually have to do with fashion, because fashion is something that surely is more of a modern thing, whereby you buy clothes and a year or two later it's all different, and over time fashion changes as to what one or another wears. This doesn't seem to be a problem to ancient Israel. In fact, we read earlier in Deuteronomy that their clothes did not wear out. Now, I don't know whether you would find that a blessing or not, but nonetheless, this is not talking about fashion. And what was happening in my youth group back there in Brighton, England, so many years ago, was actually a change of fashion. There was nothing underhand or evil about these young women beginning to wear jeans or trousers. It was a shift in fashion. And so, if accepting that be the case, what is this talking about? What would be a good interpretation? I want to say that often some of these more obscure laws that we see here, I believe, are often given to help protect Israel from being involved in idolatry. There's laws there about tattoos, about cutting your beard, about cutting yourself. There's other laws we'll find in a few minutes. And it seems that some of these laws are indeed to stop or to help protect Israel against idolatry. And as I've mentioned, the prevailing paganism in the land of Canaan was particularly the fertility gods. There was Baal, the rain god. He was the one, according to the myths, that enabled rain, and Ashtaroth, the god of fertility, who, when worshipped, would enable people to have children, or the crops to grow, or the animals to reproduce. And as these were worshipped, this enabled that. That was the belief system. The problem, apart from just pure idolatry, is that both of these were connected with a lot of sexual perversion. It was very common in Canaanite societies that men would give their daughters to serve in the temple as temple prostitutes, and young men as well. And so you didn't only have the whole prostitution thing, there was also houses of homosexual prostitutes, and often that would involve cross-dressing and transvestitism. And I would suggest to you that in the context, this verse is addressing that particular issue. And it's because of the engagement with idolatry that this thing becomes an abomination. It's not to do with some of these other innocent things like change of fashion, or even maybe someone dressing up in an acting situation. If you come upon a bird's nest or a tree or in any tree or on the ground with a fledgling or eggs, with a mother sitting on the fledglings or the eggs, you shall not take the mother with the young. Let the mother go, taking only the young for yourselves, in order that it may go well with you, and you live long, and you may live long. So again, we have another one of these more obscure laws. What is all this about? How would this apply to me today? Well, let's reflect on interpretation. In a society 3,500 years ago, you can imagine people going out and there's a wild chicken or guinea fowl or some kind of bird. And as you find them, there's a nest and there's eggs in that nest. And as you discover that, you could think to yourself, fantastic, here we have breakfast and lunch. And you take the eggs and you take the chicken or the bird, and you have eggs for breakfast and fried chicken for lunch. And it's out there, it doesn't belong to anybody, you haven't stolen anything, because it's wild and it's your find. And you could justify that. But when we reflect on that kind of scenario, we ask the question, how do we love our neighbour in this situation? Because if you take the eggs and the bird, then there won't be any eggs the next day or the next day, because you've taken not just the eggs but the source that would lay the eggs. But if you have this other thought that I'll take the eggs, they're free, but I'll leave the bird, because if I leave the bird, then there'll be more eggs, and tomorrow my neighbour may come along and they also can enjoy the benefit of this particular thing. And so we want to be really careful about not putting too much on just one small law, but it seems here there's the heart and the spirit of what today we will call sustainability, whereby we don't use up all the resources so that there's none left for anybody else. We don't take everything for ourselves and leave nothing for other people. We don't make decisions which are going to disadvantage future generations. Because even though this is one of a small law, and many of the issues, environmental issues we deal with today, were not even in the frame for people 3,500 years ago. Nevertheless, you see here a principle, and it's a small principle, but it has a profound message. And that message is how, as I use resources that I come across and find, how do I love my neighbour in using those resources? When you build a new house, you shall make a parapet for your roof. Otherwise, you may have blood guilt on your house if anyone should fall from it. Certainly, in the country I come from, this doesn't have any direct relevance, because our houses are built at an angle so rain falls off and falls into the gutter. But if we do a little bit of interpretation, we realize, of course, that in the ancient times and in nations today, the roof is a living space for the house. People would live there maybe in the evening when it's cooler. They would be there, and it would be a living space. Maybe staircase on the outside of the house, or maybe inside. But nonetheless, it was one of the living spaces. And what this law is saying is when you build a house, you need to build a parapet, a fence around the roof of your house. Why? So that those who use that space have a protection, so that they don't fall off and injure themselves, or worse, die. And I want you to notice how if someone does fall off and die, you, the builder of the house, the owner of the house, will have blood guilt on your house. In other words, this law is just again another short verse, but it has a profound principle. How do I love my neighbour? How do I not murder? I love my neighbour by taking reasonable precautions for their safety in that particular area that I'm responsible for. And if I'm not responsible, I can't do that. But if it's my house, I am responsible, and I can take this kind of safety. And the fascinating thing to me is that here there's a clear indication here of liability. If I am involved in something that is within my orbit, and I don't take reasonable precautions for the safety of others, I become liable for that. And so even though this may not be something directly related to us, it does speak of building codes. When we build, are we building in a way that's going to protect people? Are there good fire exits? Are our vehicles roadworthy? Do they have the required safety measures? We could see how this would apply, and it would be different in different economies and different societies. For us in England, we have to have a sophisticated system, because this thing of safety now is being codified, and we are required by law to do many of these things. In other societies and economies, that may not be the case. I remember I was in one place, and they didn't have a sophisticated fire system. It would not have been appropriate in that economy. But I noticed on every floor of the building there was a flashlight and a whistle. And I saw just the fact that in that economy they were trying to take care. If there was a fire and the lights went out, there would be provision there and a way to raise an alarm. And so we can see that we love our neighbour. You shall not murder. If we go up the triangle to you shall love your neighbour by taking reasonable precautions for their safety. And then we have some laws that aren't so straightforward. You shall not sow your vineyard with the second kind of seed, or with the whole yield that will be forfeited, both the crop that you have sown and the yield of the vineyard itself. And maybe this is connected to the fact of not mixing things together. A friend, an agricultural friend, said it's good that the land doesn't have to support two different plants because of taking too much from the land. So I'm not sure about this. And you know, that is okay. Sometimes we look at the law, we don't understand it, and we just think, well, at the moment I don't quite understand this. Later I may. And I want to encourage you that that is the case sometimes. Nothing important comes into that category, you will discover. Likewise, you shall not plough an ox and a donkey yoked together. You shall not wear clothes made of wool and linen together. And then the law about the tassels. And so whatever the reason for not having a mixture, it may speak about not being involved in syncretism as an illustration of that, or there may be other practical purposes. But the law about the tassel goes back to Numbers 15. It's a restating of that law, and we know the purpose of that, and that is those tassels are to remind people of the law of God. And we don't wear tassels, but there may be other things that we have to remind us of the word of the Lord to us. And it could be a plaque on the wall. It could be a ring on your finger. It could be all sorts of things. But they're there practically to remind us of the word of the Lord. And so this is about loving the Lord. That is the purpose of this particular law. And so we will be looking at some more of these as we go through Deuteronomy, but I just wanted to give you this as an example of the way that we can handle many of these laws. It is asking the question, what did it mean? What is the principle, the heart of God behind that is reflected in this law? And then how would it relate to us today? Now, what I've been doing is I've been wanting you to see the law and Deuteronomy, particularly in this session, as something that is so relevant. It's relevant to us because it does reflect and speak of the work of Jesus, and I assume that you've seen that in Leviticus and Numbers and Exodus as well as this book. And there is great wisdom for us, but more than that, God is interested in nations. God is interested in societies. And even as we have in YWAM the 7 spheres of society, there are insights from the law of God into all of those spheres of society, because this matters to God. This Old Testament is talking about God's kingdom as it was 3,500 years ago, or at least how He wanted it to be. He was the king, He was the suzerain, and He was given instructions for His kingdom, how the subjects of that kingdom should act. And as Jesus brought about the kingdom in the New Testament, it's about not just about the future. As you know, we were to pray in the Lord's Prayer, "Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven." And so the question is, what is God's will on earth? Of course, we know His will is that all people would be saved. We know His will is that there would be a strong church. But does God have a will for everything else that happens on the earth? Is He not the God of all things? Is He not the Lord of all? So if that's true, and of course it is, then God has a plan for not just the church, not just the individual believer, but for the whole of society. And so as Christians, do we have a voice in society? Do we have anything to contribute? Is there anything that we have to say? And there's 3 different books that I would commend to you that speak about this. I know as you're involved in the SBS, this is really a very busy time for you. But I want to commend to you Lauren Cunningham's book. That is the book that transforms nations. This is a marvelous reflection on how the Bible and God's values, God's principles reflect in a nation. And even though it's not a technical book, because he's a man who's traveled to every nation of the earth, out of this experience, he's able to see how, when a nation has been open to the Bible, and the values and principles of God's values have been instilled in that nation, to the measure they have been instilled in that nation, so you see that reflected in society and the prosperity and the government and the business and the education, etc., of that land. Another book I commend to you by the Indian scholar Vishal Mangalwadi. And that is the book that made your world. And this, I think of this as the technical counterpart to Lauren's book. That even as Lauren has given his example of just living and visiting nations, so Vishal has written a marvelous book on how the Bible has been indeed at the heart of Western civilization. Why is it that the West has prospered? Well, according to Vishal, it's because there has been the engaging of the Bible into society. One of the best examples, of course, is John Calvin in Geneva. Geneva had a reputation of being one of the dirtiest, smelliest cities of Europe. People would say you could smell it before you saw it, in this kind of a joking way. A terrible place. And when Calvin and his team went there, they didn't just do one thing, they did two things. Firstly, they preached the gospel. And I've been on a visit and I've seen the cathedral there in Geneva and the pulpit that Calvin preached from, and how many came to Christ. Many were born again. And that is, if you like, revival. But actually, he didn't leave it there. There was a building next door and a room, and it was there that he didn't just preach the gospel, but he taught about God's perspective on each area of society, business and education and government and family and these different areas. And he was bringing about not just people coming to know Christ, but indeed biblical values, biblical instructions right into society. And there is a whole transformation, and it's understood that the nation of Switzerland, even today, hundreds of years later, is still benefiting from the values and the understanding and the foundation that was laid at that time. You see, God has an opinion about everything. And as we have the right glasses on, and as we read law material correctly, as we look at Deuteronomy, and we're able to engage with it from these different perspectives, then we're able to see so much that can help us in our modern times. Another book that I found so helpful is by a British New Testament scholar, Old Testament scholar by the name of Christopher Wright. Christopher has written a number of works, but one of them is Old Testament Ethics for the People of God. And in this marvelous book, what he does is he engages with so much of the Old Testament law, and he engages with it from the perspective I've been talking about. How does it apply today? What is its relevance? How can we make it relate? Another resource on the screen there is a marvelous ministry out of Cambridge, England, called the Jubilee Centre. If you go to this website, you'll be able to find loads of resources. This whole ministry is dedicated to being engaged with society on the basis of the teaching of Scripture. What is it that Scripture says? And they have loads of resources written by people with expertise in the different areas. So expertise, people engaged in law are talking about the justice system. People engaged in economics, from the biblical perspective, taxation, etc. People involved in government and the different areas. And I commend it to you as a marvelous resource. There you'll find what they call the Cambridge Papers. These are produced periodically, and what they are experts in different areas engaging with the day-to-day issues of life. And so, just to conclude this particular piece, different ways that we can read the law. Of course, we can read it as individual believers, and this is probably what you've been doing up to now. You can read it with that question, what does this mean to me in my personal life? And there may be lots of lessons and challenges and encouragements we can receive. We can look at it in the light of the redeemed community, the church. What does this have to say today? How can we, as God's people, be an alternative society in our towns and our cities? What does that mean and what does that look like? But also the text can be interpreted in the light of a wider society. We can ask, what questions does this give us we can ask the question, what does this give us to say to society at large? How does this change our collective culture? We can ask the question, what godly values and priorities can we promote and work for at society at large? What authentic voice do we have? And so this is lifting this out in a whole different level of engagement. Christopher Wright says in his book, Ethics and the Old Testament People of God, that Israel is a paradigm. A paradigm is a model that can be applied in various situations by using a single set of governing principles. And so he says Israel is a paradigm, this ancient Israel. In one single culture and one slice of history, we see demonstrated the kind of social values God looks for in human life generally. So using the model of paradigm, we can take the whole into account. So it's not a matter of principle hunting, a little principle there, principle here, but rather you take the whole together. Israel as a society was intended from the start to be a paradigm or a model to the nations, a showcase of the way God longs for human society as a whole to operate. That's on page 74 of his book. And so, friends, as we study Deuteronomy, as we think of it with this particular glasses, we see something very profound. It's something where we can explore and see the wisdom of God, not just applied personally, but at society at large.